today's lecture. Maybe we can get going. My name is David Russell Jensen. My Chilkat name is Shakaguk. I am the development officer here at Sealaska Heritage, and I'm pleased to welcome you to our lecture series. Sealaska Heritage Institute is a Native nonprofit dedicated to perpetuating and enhancing the Chilkat, Haida, and Tsimshian cultures of Southeast Alaska. As a nonprofit organization, Sealaska Heritage relies on donations and grants to implement and fund our incredible programs in Juneau and throughout Southeast Alaska and beyond. If you'd like to contribute, you can visit sealaskaheritage.org/giving. Our lecture today is presented by Kadusné Ursala Hudson and is titled The Gendered Burden of Cultural Continuity. An interdisciplinary artist and Chilkat weaver, Hudson will explore the often invisible labor of cultural survival carried by historically female gendered Indigenous art forms, such as weaving, sewing, and beading. Hudson will examine how these practices, which are often dismissed as quote-unquote craft or domestic work, are foundational to Indigenous sovereignty, memory, and resilience. If you're here with us in person, please silence your cell phones and welcome Ursula. Thank you.
Thank you. Man, what else do I say? That covered all of it. Kadusné dechad duasak dakten tan ayachad kashai hididach. It's good to see you all here with me. It's been a gift to get to spend the past couple weeks here in residence, hang out with my aunties and all the local visitors. Yeah. And just talking with you all about what makes us happy and healthy and thriving. And to really get to feel that in my body. I'm from Colorado, so I don't get to experience that a lot. So yeah, I am Ursala Hudson. I am an interdisciplinary artist. So I'm a weaver, I'm a painter, a scholar, and performer sometimes. I'm in a rock band. But all of these art forms are kind of intertwined or very intertwined with one another, and they all contribute to this larger web of understanding perspectives, authentic expression, reflection, healing, growth, that hopefully, my movements reach out into different directions and affect the larger world. So, yes, I am the daughter of the late Clarissa Rizal Lampy Hudson, who apprenticed under the prolific Chilkat weaver Jenny Thanat. And I'm also the baby sister of Lily Hope, who's now leading the newly founded Northwest Coast Textile Center initiative. I am Daktain Tan Raven with our ancestral homelands in Glacier Bay, and although I was raised in the high mountain desert of Pagosa Springs, Colorado, down in the Southwest, a little north of Santa Fe, I really believe that this distance has created a plethora of tension, personally, artistically, politically, questions of belonging and legacy. And I think that my unique lens that I've developed has placed me in this room today. So I'm really grateful to get to speak with you all today about this work. So I grew up alongside my full-time artist parents, and I was homeschooled. So I've really been making art my whole life. My parents, Bill and Clarissa, were both part of the Chilkat culture revitalization renaissance of the 70s and 80s, even though my dad is white. So my childhood was shaped around, culture-centered art practices. Before COVID, I worked as a graphic designer, and when the pandemic hit, I lost all my clients. And that opened the door for me to really drop into weaving full time. And so following down my mother's path, I started a collection of woven pieces inspired by really modern silhouettes, my mixed heritage, the environment around me. And I'm just sharing these works with you to kind of give you a backstory here. So I paired these weavings with a line of really simple black garments, and before long I had a few ensembles that really carried me into an international art, Indigenous art world. And some key opportunities came along that brought this work into both Indigenous and non-Indigenous spaces. And it elevated the work to a level that I really hadn't even had time to dream about. And so it's been a huge honor to represent the Chilkat culture at this level and to represent women's art in general. But I do know that this work is not mine. It is an extension of my parents and my family and my mentors and my ancestors and my mom. You know, it's work that moves through me. You know, I think we all know in this room that doing work that's passed on to us from our culture reminds us that our work is just this continuous expression of the greater whole. And so I wanted to continue seeing what would come through, what else my mom and my mentors and my ancestors might express through my hands. So I applied for the Masters of Fine Arts program at the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe to be shaped in new ways, to express in new ways. And that program encouraged a lot of experimentation and exploration over material production. And it really pushed us students to consciously evaluate our ancestral practices and understand our unique positionality in these Indigenous and international art spaces. And it required us to develop a thesis. And that requirement really allowed me to examine consciously and honor consciously female gendered art practices. So beading, weaving, embroidery aren't just functional and beautiful. In many Indigenous contexts, they are spiritual technologies. They hold ancestral knowledge, and yet these practices have been systematically devalued, right? Not only by the colonialist, capitalist structure, but sometimes from within our own communities. So today I want to name where female gendered art forms stand in our communities and how we might better elevate them, not just for the survival and preservation of these traditions, but for the collective thriving of future generations. So two main ideas that have guided me through all of this work are that art isn't just beauty and decoration. It's not only about representing clan crests or evoking spirit in the dancer. It's the practice itself, the practice of art, that's a tool for healing and resisting injustice and for keeping our community strong and connected. And then second, that the systems of capitalism, colonialism, and the heteropatriarchy have worked together to devalue the kinds of art practices that I am talking about. And they are alive and active and well with us right here in this space today. And this devaluation hasn't just hurt women or Indigenous people, it affects everybody. Because the devaluation of these art practices have broken some of the oldest teachings we have about how to live well with each other and the land we're all affected. So when I talk about colonialism, I'm talking about invasion and theft. I'm talking about taking land, taking resources, and taking away ways of life, right? It's not just history, it's a system still shaping our lives today. And it works by enforcing control, by erasing Indigenous governance and kinship and sovereignty. And then capitalism is this economic system that's built on extraction. It takes the essence of people and communities and the earth, and it converts it into profit, and it reduces life into something to be used up. So labor is to be consumed, resources are to be depleted, and money is always put above well-being. And then the heteropatriarchy is a system that consolidates power in the hands of straight men. And it enforces hierarchies that push aside women's leadership and erase gender diversity and undermine whole community-centered ways of life. And patriarchy doesn't always need men to run it. Even when women hold authority, they are often expected to govern within the rules of patriarchy. And then when I talk about female gendered art practices, I'm not just talking about cisgendered women, those, assigned female at birth and who still identify that way. Practices like weaving and sewing and basketry, beadwork, have long been labeled as women's work, but they have been carried forward by people of all genders. So the phrase female gendered art describes a category of practices that are tied to care. So of the home, of the land, and of future generations. So know that that's what I'm talking about. These practices are the work of keeping our communities connected. And I also want to point out that gender coding, or the way that societies label certain roles or activities or traits as male or female, have never been universal, has shifted across time and across space and even within our own individual selves. And I acknowledge that gender wasn't always locked into a fixed binary the way that Western systems have tried to kind of code that. And when we remember that, then the picture really opens up, and these practices weren't dismissed because they were trivial or lesser. They were targeted because they carry transformative, community-sustaining power, and that's a power that still unsettles colonial and patriarchal systems today. Just me. So this research was prompted by some mildly disorienting experiences that I've had over the past few years as a full-time craftsperson, a female craftsperson that is rooted in Indigenous worldviews. And I was surprised to find that institutions and individuals I had begun working with had capitalist motives. So those motives started to reframe my work to fit into these extractive systems in these institutions, systems that diminished this work's real purpose and diluted its power. So I became a resource to be extracted. And even within Indigenous organizations, organizations meant to protect and elevate our cultures, I saw how colonial structures of power are present and sometimes pushing aside the very people and practices that they are created to support. So I was being invited into these cultural institutions, but misrecognized once I was there and treated like a symbol of tradition while my agency was kind of stripped away, or my deeper intentions were misunderstood. And the more I engaged in this system, the clearer it became that these institutions might be trying to preserve culture, but they're often doing it without questioning the very structures that continue to suppress culture. So one example was I was commissioned to create this Chilkat backdrop for the Ak Rock Indigenous Music Festival. An amazing project, I was grateful to participate in. And the director had heard about our customary practice of clan leaders cutting up Chilkat robes during parties and giving out pieces to notable community members. And, that's a very on-brand Tlingit protocol that demonstrates gratitude and reinforces these systems of reciprocity. And protocols like this are what help foster a strong sense of interconnection between our clans. So the festival director's idea was to cut up the backdrop and give pieces to the performers and the organizers to reawaken this practice in a contemporary way. But on the night of the event, I learned that the whole project was reframed, and instead of the work being, like a key figure in a cultural protocol, it became a monetary investment. And because it costs so much to commission, it has been stored for reuse, and the payoff ceremony has been indefinitely delayed. So our community leaders are supposed to be protecting Indigenous resources, and resources are not just material things, but living practices and energies that sustain us. Yet this choice to prioritize material value over ceremonial purpose shows how deeply capitalist motives have seeped into our leadership, and in the process, they disrupt the very practices that once sustained our clan relations and our spiritual well-being. And so, after seeing this kind of thing play out in a few different institutions, I began to think more critically about how female-gendered art forms dismissed as craft are treated, and it became clear that their devaluation isn't just a symptom of oppression, it is one of the ways that oppression continues. When these practices are dismissed, entire communities are kept marginalized across generations and across the world. So before I became a professional weaver, I lived in a very different world. I lived in a bubble, and I thought everyone kind of lived in this world where creativity and ceremony and performance and expression are part of daily life. I was homeschooled, in that environment, surrounded by artists and activists and social deviants. Growing up, I honestly thought the whole world treated art and artists as central and vital and powerful. And I understood that from the very beginning, that art is life and life is art. And the way that we move with our hands and what comes from those movements are extensions of our relationships to the natural world, to the spiritual world, to each other. And our movements both express and are shaped by our relationships to time and to space and to community. And how we care for each other is shaped by our art. And our art is shaped by how we care for each other. And what we create, whether it's visual or sonic or kinetic, is shaped by how we move through the world and by how the world moves us. So our creations become extensions of our values and our aesthetics, reaching backward and forward through time. And in this way, aesthetics are not just surface decoration. They are systems of knowledge, and they carry memory, and they train perception. So our objects, our belongings, are born of the land, and they carry information. And the practice itself, the doing, the making, trains us to face challenges and reimagine solutions and navigate changing or new relationships. And working with our hands doesn't just train our minds, it trains our hearts. So it orients us in community and in time, tying us to our ancestors, to our descendants, and to our more than human family. And art reminds us that we are nature. So making becomes stewardship. So no, art isn't just decorative, it's a conduit for spiritual power and ancestral relationship and cultural memory, and it is vital. But what often gets overlooked is how that labor is treated differently depending on who is doing it and what kind of work it is. So weaving, beadwork, sewing, adornment, these have been and they still are mostly women's work, and then the carving and the painting and the sculpture are more often done by men. And both roles are essential to our cultural survival and our sovereignty. But I think, under colonial influence, labor coded as male has been increasingly professionalized and paid for. And then the labor coded as female has been expected to remain unpaid and treated as an honor rather than a livelihood. And that's true whether we're talking about whether we're in Indigenous spaces or non-Indigenous spaces. Men are commissioned to carve totem poles, canoes, monuments, and then weavers are expected to volunteer hundreds of hours despite the undeniable cultural value of their work. We use this work in ceremony. We all know how valuable this is, but it gets framed as a donation of leisure time, offered up in service of community. And this joy of weaving, the healing found in community, in being together as women, that's real. But how do we honor cultural caretakers while denying them material support? What does it mean when honoring becomes another form of extraction? Weavers are positioned as these cultural caretakers and expected to give, but then not receive. And their contributions are called priceless and yet somehow aren't worth paying for. And calling it an honor turns unpaid labor into something sacred, And it makes it a lot harder to challenge the injustice underneath. And this imbalance reveals this deeper thing that when female coded work is treated as love and male coded work is treated as labor, cultural continuity becomes a gendered burden. So taking part in these nourishing practices often requires profound levels of privilege, not because the work itself, demands it, not because the work is hard to access, but because the systems that we live in make it that way. You need time, you need financial security, and the right connections and opportunities to participate. And we don't just face these pressures from the outside, we internalize them, and we start to believe that caring for culture is something we must give freely, without pay, without protection, and sometimes without regard for our own well-being. So that's why I have been looking closely at these systems that distort our sense of worth and diminish the value of women's contributions. And these systems are colonialism, capitalism, and the heteropatriarchy. So colonialism didn't just take land and resources, it dismantled Indigenous sovereignty at every level, right? To control the land, colonial powers suppressed our systems of governance, of kinship, of gender and sexuality, and they imposed the gender binary and the nuclear family model, undermining women's traditional authority and contributions. And colonial ideas of civilization rewrote what counted as value, as progress, as belonging. And at the same time, the heteropatriarchy erased non-Western gender identities, reshaping our societies to mirror Western hierarchies. So our traditional knowledge systems were overwritten, replaced by these Western ways of knowing, and that project didn't end. It continues today. And it's alive and well in our public education systems and our museums and our art markets. So with schools, take schools. So even after the boarding school era, children are still trained to self-assimilate, to measure their worth through grades and awards and marketable skills, and not through their intrinsic gifts or community contributions. And that's because schools are preparing kids to serve the market, not the community. And this reinforces that gendered burden of cultural continuity by making cultural caretaking something done on the side, unpaid, and a lot of times done by women. So, real engagement with art and land and community teaches us something else other than what we learn in these public schools. It teaches us listening and care and resilience, and it gives us the true tools of critical thinking and belonging. And that is exactly why capitalism depends on suppressing those lessons, because if our children were raised with these lessons, if they were taught through natural hands-on ways of learning, they would have the very tools to stand in direct opposition to colonialism. And then there's the museums. They're often seen as these places of preservation, but they're also these sites of cultural erasure. By curating our belongings, they've controlled how we're represented and how we're misrepresented. And our objects that have been taken under duress are stripped from their communities and placed behind glass and reframed as symbols of conquest or exotic curiosity. And what was once a living item made by hand, used in ceremony, becomes frozen in time. It becomes a specimen, it becomes a relic, or it becomes a craft. And those labels matter. The moment something is called a craft instead of art, or primitive instead of contemporary, it's pushed into the margins and devalued not only economically, but spiritually. And this has especially affected female gendered art forms, weaving, basketry, beading, dismissed as decorative or domestic. And then their ties to knowledge and place and prayer are erased. And in this way, museums reinforce the gendered burden of cultural continuity generation after generation. And finally, the art market, all throughout the 20th century, non-Indigenous authorities decided what counted as authentic Indigenous art. They shaped it through exhibitions, through policies, through well-meaning artistic initiatives, and through the market that reached into colonized communities all over the world. And so in the Arctic, for example, James Houston, this guy named James, he told Indigenous artists what to make with these pamphlets and art classes. He went into these communities, told them what to make and how to make it look, and dictated if they were primitive enough or unspoiled enough, aesthetically to fit Western tastes, mid-century modern tastes, where the primitive was fetishized. And art was no longer a knowledge system, but a means of survival for these communities. And any innovation was labeled as corruption or cultural decline. And these imposed ideas commodified Indigenous art and deepened these gendered divisions of labor. So carved and painted and sculptural works, the ones that aligned with fine art, were privileged and invested in. And woven, beaded, and sewn works, practices that are rooted in daily life and ceremony and in care, were pushed into the margins and labeled as domestic or craft or leisure, and the market makes that hierarchy visible. So this argillite totem pole is about a foot tall, and it auctioned for 11 grand. And it's really comparable in time and expertise to this domestic item, which was woven with the labor-intensive material preparation of cedar root and sold in auction for $144. And this painted Chilkat tunic pattern board auctioned for $42,000. $42,000. That's right. This painted board was $42,000, and this Chilkat blanket, which was done around the same time, probably took 1,500 hours to weave. And it auctioned for $15,000. So even when time and expertise are comparable, the values are not, right? And this isn't just about money. These values decide whose work is sustained and whose survival becomes a gendered burden. So when women's work is devalued by capitalism and colonialism, it loses not only its market worth, but its cultural, utilitarian, and its spiritual power. And when this happens, whole communities are stripped of the training systems that once fostered diplomacy and compassion and critical thinking and belonging. And when we devalue women's work, we devalue the very tools we need to be connected and resilient communities. And that limits not only our access to culture, but culture's access to us. This is how the future itself becomes constrained. This is how the future becomes constrained. Restrict our access to creation, and we restrict our ability to shape the futures we want to live in. So that's why I believe that rematriation, or the rematriation of female gendered art is one of the most necessary acts of community care and radical activism. So rematriation, as opposed to repatriation, isn't about the return of objects. Rematriation is the reviving of living knowledge, protocols, cosmologies. It means reclaiming trust in women's hands, in feminine forms of leadership, and in cyclical ways of living and knowing. So repatriation might return a symbol, but it doesn't restore the relationships or the protocols or the spiritual power that were stolen with it. And full rematriation does, and that's why it threatens the colonial project. Rematriation threatens the colonial project. Until institutions embrace rematriation, restoring not just objects, but also female-coded practices and leadership, until this happens, decolonization will always remain incomplete. So here at SHI, we see these really powerful examples of Chilkat Haida Tsimshian art being embraced and celebrated, and the work of reclaiming this reverence for our practices is real, and it's important, and it's happening. And at the same time, SHI's governance model and its strong emphasis on collecting male-made art reminds us that we still have a lot of internal work to do. And this isn't just leftover colonial residue. It reflects the gender imbalances still alive in our communities. In many ways, SHI operates within a repatriation framework. It returns symbols. But rematriation asks more. It asks for the restoration of balance, of practices, of values, and leadership styles that come from us, not from colonialism, not from capitalism. And those things, they sustain our communities in the way I think we all want. So when I look at today's efforts in these institutions and museums and schools, even here at SHI, I don't just see solutions, but they are openings. These efforts are openings. They're starting points where we can begin reimagining education, markets, governance on our own terms, because simply reforming colonial institutions or copying their models keeps us tethered to those same structures of power that are oppressing us. But if we turn toward rematriation and we begin to design systems rooted in community-centered values, holistic care, and the futures we really do want to live in, that's where it's at. That's where it's at. This isn't about removing focus from the male-gendered practices. It's about naming the erasure caused by the marginalization of female-gendered ones, both in Indigenous communities and across global systems of value. And at the very least, this means more institutional funding for female-gendered practices. Not necessarily their art, but more funding for the practices. But it also means restructuring these museums, schools, and markets to reflect their true power, to reflect the true power of the practices. And we must raise their perceived worth to match male-gendered practices and make space for all forms of creation across and beyond binaries. And ironically, colonial's dismissal of women's work as domestic or insignificant actually meant that many of these practices were preserved. If they had been monitored, we might have lost all the power inside. So this quiet endurance of these female-gendered practices is a deeper form of resistance. While male-dominated forms were commodified, female-gendered practices remain these active sites of cultural retrieval and continuity. So through material practice, we affirm our value to each other, to the land, and to the greater whole. And art isn't just survival, it's a way to return to ourselves and to build grounded, connected people with a strong sense of place and purpose. And while I've centered these female-gendered practices today, my advocacy is for all creative practices, because every one of them holds the potential to liberate and repair, because the work of cultural survival should never be a gendered burden. It must be a collective act of remembering and resisting and reimagining together. And that's it. Kunakshish.
Kunakshish. Kunakshish. We have some time for questions from the audience. If anybody, okay. Shannon, here you go.
Do you see the value of textile art in the same way in some gendered practice, say between Chilkat and Raven's Tail?
I'm sorry, I was distracted.
It's
What?
okay.
Can you say it one more time?
I'm not really sure what I'm trying to ask. I'm trying to ask if you see any gendered differences between textile art in Raven's Tail and Chilkat, and the preservation of those practices and patterns.
Gendered differences between
Raven's Tail and Chilkat, or do you, for whom these artists, these pieces being woven for certain people, are Raven's Tail and Chilkat woven for a particular gender or by a certain gender, or do you see one over the other being preserved because maybe it was woven for a man or woven for a woman? Or I'm just wondering if there's any gendered practices in textile art.
That's a really good question. Huh.
I didn't mean to break you.
I mean, that's a pretty good prediction, or, yeah, I mean, as far as we can tell, you know, the most prominent, you know, the clan, like the men get to wear the woven stuff because they get to dance in the forefront, and they might have more resources to commission a robe. Yeah, maybe you're onto something there. Anyone else want to answer that?
Sure.
Slightly following up on that, just my 2 cents. I do think part of the reasoning is that some parts of weaving might be more focused on preserving than others is the value of it. The materials differ slightly between them, and therefore the time it takes and the dedication to that weaving style might be different. And so then, because the weavings are currently set as a lower value, they go for the one that has the faster payoff. Just my thoughts.
I just realized on this trip that not everybody knows in Juneau that Raven's Tail, no one practiced Raven's Tail for a couple hundred years. And it was just revived in the 80s. So just in case not all of us were aware of that in this room. Yeah, it was reawoken by a non-Indigenous weaver, Cheryl Samuel. And yes, it takes maybe half as long to weave Raven's Tail as it does Chilkat. But I'd say I see just as many Raven's Tail robes today being made as Chilkat.
Okay. In my limited knowledge of this, my recollection is that Chilkat blankets, the pattern was historically determined by men making pattern boards, and Raven's Tail weaving didn't have that restriction with it. Is that correct?
Well, I think that anything Raven's Tail, like spiritual protocols or like knowledge about how designs were created, is just speculative. So much was lost. But yeah, and I do question, like, is that true that men designed the Chilkat pattern boards? For example, I worked with my latest weaving with James Johnson to develop that design, and I told him everything to put on that, and he like, you know, laid out the design, but it was definitely a collaboration, and I wonder how much of our history has been distorted from like through the patriarchy to make us believe that male artists were the ones who designed those boards. Maybe they just painted them.
Right. I had a hard time making that work. Okay.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think in the Western art world, we understand, or it's kind of assumed that men have this access to like this genius or this divine, and it's like this spiritual state in which they get to enter. And that's what makes their art so cool and valuable, is it's like unique and it's coming from the other side. And that's been happening with women forever also. It's just, I think the labeling of craft and the fact that a lot of times we work together in like the same room, and then a lot of times we're like working through ideas together, and it's more collective, diminishes its value.
I was just curious if you had any advice for someone who wants to explore going into either artistry or specifically textiles and weaving. Young, old, anybody who wants to explore that path.
I think you should do it. Weaving, I notice like anytime I go outside or I'm talking to people, I notice that my technical training, like the way that I move my hands and the way that I understand lines, affects my perception of how I not only perceive the world, but how I interact with other humans, and how I tend to, the more I weave, tend to actually consider other people more. And it's kind of helped me like gain some sort of sense of like empathy. And so I wish for everyone to be a weaver. I think we would all be happier if we all understood the basics of weaving to an extent, or to some level. Advice is trust in, if you want to be a full-time weaver, trust in God. Believe, like, know that like this is what we need to, we need weavers in this world. Weavers twine the tapestry that keeps us all together, and the greater nature creator wants more weavers. That's what I believe. And if you can remember that, you'll realize day after day that you are gifted the resources to continue a daily practice or a career in the arts of any sort. You just have to like believe that you are deserving, and that, yeah, your role is vital. It's just hard to remember that when we live in this kind of world where we're told that being an artist is not viable.
As you talk on rematriation, I'm curious as what is your takeaway on colonization, patriarchy, or social justice as we look at the differences in privileges that perhaps male artists have in this hierarchy in the valuation of gender-coded art?
Can you rephrase that in a different way?
What have you found as far as social justice issues or equity is concerned when we're discussing these gendered art forms? What have you found in doing this art and seeing, have you felt more inclined towards social justice issues? Are you seeing that perhaps women artists are more vocal in these things because of the inequity in the art form?
Yeah, I believe, I'm not sure if I'm going to answer this question the way you want. I believe there's great power in these collective spaces. Okay, so like I believe in this kitchen table logic. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but the kitchen table is this space where people get together in a casual way. They are free to arrive however they are, whatever state they're in. They don't have to perform. They can come to the table quiet. They can come to the table enthusiastic. They can come to the table with food. They can come to the table hungry. We work on our projects. We discuss ideas. We might say something really stupid and are corrected. We might share a profound idea. And this space is where revolutions are dreamed up. Because without these kind of safe spaces to be whoever you are, we can't have these moments of like new ideas and revolution. And so in that way, I think that, yeah, to engage in female gendered practices, which a lot of times do require a coming together that's very similar to the kitchen table, like getting together in weaving circles or beading circles, offer that kind of space of connection and security. Have I seen that play out in my own circles? Yes. I just in the past few years, I've gotten to know people who weren't radical whatsoever, and after a few gatherings around food, yeah, they're radicalized. I don't know. I don't see any huge things happening yet, but I think that's probably because we don't know how to broadcast that to a wider world safely yet. But yeah, I think that all revolutions or radical ideas come from a space like this.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. It was a wonderful lecture. My question was, I think it's been super clear at an institutional level that there's particularly a lot of systematic change that needs to happen when helping and approaching this disparity. I wanted to know, what would be your advice for people on a day-to-day basis as a cultural practitioner, as a buyer, as an artist? Maybe I can't control what the museum does or what is happening with large monumental art, but what can people be doing on a day-to-day basis to help with this?
Talking about it, I just found out that I thought that Crystal Worrell's mural over there on the library was like finally some monumental women's work in this town that was paid for. And she like instigated all the fundraising for it and got paid like nothing. And I wouldn't have known that if she hadn't innocently just shared that, you know, she was proud that she had raised a few $1,000s. She shared this on social media. And yeah, over the past couple of years, I've just assumed that we're going in the right direction. But yeah, we need to talk about these things. We need to be brave, and whether it is social media or out in public or just with friends at the bar, like discussing wins, like where we have been improving, discussing losses, or not losses, but those disparities more. I think communication is the lubrication of everything, of all social justice. I definitely think that we should all be advocating for more gathering, being together and eating and making, and seeing the value in that. Like, okay, usually institutions want to fund a project, and they want like the start date and the end date, and then they want the product, because that is a symbol of success to some degree, or like presence. Like it represents presence. But we need to reframe that value and be like, no, like there's value in unseen things, such as people getting together and learning and failing and just being together. And we somehow need to like talk to our representatives, the institution directors, about like, we don't always need to have a product. We just need to be together.
Okay, we have our final question, and I know that we started a little bit late, so we are going to have one more question. And then you were here for a little bit longer in the artist in residence studio as well, if you wanted to share anything about that too. So here's our final question, and then thank you.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for your amazing talk. It's very eye-opening, and even though we don't see that many guys here, unfortunately, which I think that your talk is really related and for them to hear. And my question is kind of related to Christine's question. What is your expectation from male artists, how they can advocate for you as, you know, their artists are native, and what do you want to see from their end to kind of minimize this gap we talked about? Thank you.
I'd love to see more like stipulations, or what is it, like the rider that they might include with their contract. Like, I'm not doing this totem pole unless a Chilkat robe is made.
Repeat that.
For every totem pole that is raised, there should be a Chilkat robe commissioned.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think that there's more of an understanding across genders that there's space for all of us. Like, this isn't a competition. There's enough money and space for all of us. And I hear male artists say that, but I don't see it really yet. Their action, like I see them uplifting each other a lot of times, and like sharing their opportunities with each other. But we definitely need to see more of that, like, sharing opportunity. Like, that is not commonly practiced up here, or anywhere from the men. I got to be part of this Venice Biennale exhibition over the past year. The Venice Biennale is like the art Olympics of the world, and the artist who was chosen to represent the United States was the first Indigenous artist to ever represent the United States in 150 years, and his name is Jeffrey Gibson, and he is one of the biggest Indigenous artists in the world. And he raised $8 million to share his opportunity of representing the United States with as many people as he could. So educators, artists, performers, scholars. And that requires a certain level of generosity and awareness as to like how, when one of us is elevated, we all rise up. That we just need to foster in our boys. Like, we need to like just teach our boys and our girls how important that is to just bring each other up. Oh, and then my totem pole. I am only here for the rest of today through 4 p.m. and then tomorrow from 9 to 4. And then I leave back to Colorado on Sunday. But I'm demonstrating weaving in the residency room, Dolores Churchill room. And I'm working on an 8-foot totem pole weaving that is woven flat, but it will be wrapped around a flat-backed column. So wrapped around the totem pole form. And that project is definitely related to everything that I'm passionate about and what I've talked about today. So I'm only in like the first 15% chunk of the project, so I have another year to work. But if you could come visit me, I'd love that. I love spending time with you all. Yeah, visitors are welcome, and I'd love to share this work with you. Thank you.
And this was recorded, so we can make it available later. I apologize again for the live stream not working. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for introducing me.